G'day everyone, you know that I'm a hardcore Navy enjoyer in Hearts of Iron 4, and to date I've made no less than 3 dedicated guides for the Navy, and it's featured pretty heavily in more than a few others. It has been a while though, so today I'm working with Machiavellian Strategist, an amazing Hoi 4 YouTuber, to bring you an in-depth guide to the Navy. He's an absolute legend, and he's got a super deep library of detailed, top-tier guides, so I recommend you guys all go and check out his channel. I'll link it in the description below. Before we get into the designs, let's go through a refresher on how the naval mechanics work. The ships in your Navy are split into 3 categories: screens, capital ships, and submarines. The best way to explain how these work is by showing you a naval combat. In naval combat, your screens are the front line. They protect your capital ships from enemy fire, especially from torpedoes. They target the enemy screens first and foremost, and then if there are no screens left, they'll target the backlines. As a general rule, you want a ratio of 4 screens to 1 capital ship to effectively screen them. Capital ships have the big guns with a lot of firepower. They can fire over the enemy screening line, targeting the enemy capital ships first. Aircraft carriers are technically also capital ships, but they sit behind your battleships and battle cruisers and stuff, and they are screened from torpedoes by both your screens and your other capital ships. Your aircraft carriers will then launch their planes, which will go ahead and target the other enemy capital ships. Submarines sneak in beneath the waves and target enemy capital ships with their torpedoes. They can only be hit with depth charges, which Machiavellian Strategist will explain when he talks about the research modules. When looking at the stats of your ships, there are a few important ones that you need to know, starting with the 2 main types of attack that your ships have: light and heavy attack. The guns on your screens will do light attack, targeting other screens first, and your capital ships will do heavy attack, which target enemy capitals first. Another stat that you should be aware of is AA, or anti-aircraft. When enemy naval bombers attack your fleet, whether they be from aircraft carriers or being land-based, your own ship's AA will attempt to shoot them down and reduce their effectiveness. As aircraft target the largest ships first in a naval combat, AA is typically most effective on your battleships. Speed is another stat that you should know about, and it affects a few different things on your ships. Firstly, a higher speed increases the chance for your ships to dodge enemy fire. Secondly, it allows your fleet to run down an enemy fleet to engage in combat more effectively. You should be aware that your task forces only move as fast as the slowest ship in the group, so be mindful of this when making your designs and organizing your ships. The last stat which is really important for you to know is manpower. When vying for naval supremacy to launch your naval invasions and prevent that of the enemy, manpower is the most significant factor in determining who has naval supremacy. Typically, whichever side has the most manpower in a region will take naval supremacy.
Everything that Hammo just explained for the Navy always applies to the game, whether you are playing it with DLCs or without. However, exactly like for tanks and planes, being able to design your own ships gives you a huge advantage, especially when playing against the AI. To unlock the Navy Designer itself, you need to own the Man the Guns DLC or the DLC subscription. You can then change modules on your ships exactly like for the tank and plane designer, in this case at the cost of Navy experience. Changing designs is not usually too expensive, so you can usually get the required Navy experience just by training your starting fleet. If that's not an option, however, picking a Navy advisor early on might be a good choice. To unlock additional modules and hulls, you will also need to complete the relative naval researches. This is a critical topic, since the Navy usually plays a much less important role than divisions and air forces. What I mean by this is that for as much as possible we want to limit the amount of research slots we dedicate to the Navy, as well as the resources and buildings we invest in it. For this reason, in principle, we are not upgrading past the 1936 technologies, especially in terms of hulls, as that's all you need to defeat the AI. The only modules that are really worth upgrading are the Fire Control System, which is actually in the Engineering tab, and the Radar Special Project, which is part not of the Naval Facility, but of the Air Facility. These 2 upgrades are particularly important because they directly affect your chances to detect and to hit enemy ships. It is also important to consider that refitting a navy upgrading your existing ships is much more efficient than building one from zero, and focusing only on a few optimized designs is often the best choice. Finally, do keep in mind that with the By Blood Alone DLC, it is also possible to take enemy navies during peace conferences, effectively allowing you to quickly build up a navy even when starting from zero. That being said, the designs we're about to introduce to you are ranked by cost effectiveness, starting with the best ones and ending with the more situational ones. And when it comes to cost effectiveness, well, nothing beats a good carrier.
Carriers are the behemoths of the waves, symbols of power projection, and in Hoi 4, possibly the most effective type of ship when used correctly. Although they can be expensive to build, if you make the investment, they will turn even the smallest country into a significant naval power. Carriers are best used as part of a larger fleet, supported by battleships and lots of screens. They should be used to hunt and engage the enemy fleet in overwhelming numbers, letting their naval bombers decimate enemy ships while they're engaged by your frontline ships. The best mission to assign your carrier task force to is the Strike Force mission, when covering off sea zones or hunting enemy fleets. If you put them on patrol, they will absolutely hemorrhage fuel, so Strike Force is by far the most economical option unless you are the United States. One thing to keep in mind is that your task forces should not exceed 4 carriers per group. Each carrier above this limit will incur a 20% penalty to your aircraft sorties, and this can stack up to an 80% penalty. So you're better off starting a new task force with your extra carriers in them.
The most important stat when building a carrier is without doubts the deck size. As Hammo explained, carriers are not supposed to directly engage in a fight. Their role is rather to allow your naval bombers to get the job done for you, as carrier naval bombers are much more effective than regular ones. The only other important stat here is anti-air, since as we mentioned, enemy bombers will target larger ships first, including carriers. All considered, this design would be my go-to when it comes to carriers. As for the naval bombers, you can just stick to this very basic design, improving the torpedoes as you unlock further technologies. In this way, 1 or 2 military factories will be enough to keep your carriers at full capacity for the entire run. One last very important thing to consider is that since naval supremacy primarily depends on the manpower, carriers are by far the most cost-effective ships at getting naval supremacy without fighting. And for this specific purpose, building empty carriers, like this one, with only the bare minimum amount of modules, is a great choice since they are particularly cheap. This strategy can be incredibly useful when playing a country that cannot compete with the enemy navies, but thanks to empty carriers can still get naval supremacy long enough to trigger naval invasions.
Cruisers are probably the most versatile class of ship in the game. By adding on light guns, you can make probably the most effective type of ship in the game right now being a light cruiser. These can fill a variety of roles depending on the design. They can be stacked full of light attack and used to shred enemy screens, or given radar, sonar, and some float planes to be used as spotting cruisers to detect enemy fleets for your carriers and battleships to engage. Heavy cruisers use the same hull but sport heavy cannons. These are more like your typical glass cannons where they have a relatively high damage output that are comparatively weak, especially when you're looking at your battleships. Although they are faster, they are still quite expensive to make, and due to this, they are less used than the larger, more armored ships. Given how versatile your light cruisers are, you can use them in almost any fleet composition. For your light attack cruisers, they can either be thrown in with your main fleet, or you can even run a navy with just light cruisers. For the spotting cruisers, these are best set to the never engage rule, broken into task forces of just 1 ship per task force, and then set to the patrol mission. Given that there's only 1 ship per task force in this fleet, you can easily afford to run them on the patrol mission for extended periods, allowing your main fleet, which is on the strike force mission in the same sea zones, to come out and engage the enemy once they're spotted by your cruisers. If you are looking at running a fleet made up just of lighter ships, the benefit of this is you can more easily afford the fuel cost with running them on the patrol or convoy escort missions. Otherwise, you can save that precious black gold by putting them on the strike force mission. It's really dependent on your circumstance.
Light cruisers have a few advantages over carriers. First of all, while not as cost effective, they are, individually taken, cheaper. Moreover, they are much more commonly available, meaning you will likely steal some from your opponents, which you can then refit to this optimized design, and depending on the country, you might have them available from the very beginning of the game, saving you some precious research slots. Finally, while a carrier-only fleet is obviously not viable, a light cruisers-only fleet can work surprisingly well. On light cruisers, we primarily care about one stat, and that is light attack. Now, Hammo already perfectly explained the difference between light and heavy attack. What we could add to that is that the AI-made fleet are primarily composed of smaller ships, and once those are gone, well, the larger ones will not last very long. In short, this design will shred enemy fleets so quickly that they will not even have time to react. In terms of modules, you have a couple of choices depending on how much you want to invest in it. First of all, up here you can use, instead of the secondary batteries, more of these light cruiser batteries. They will increase the light attack at the cost of max speed and a slightly higher production cost. The other big choice concerns the armor. No armor means a cheaper design, one less steel per dockyard, and higher max speed. And it is absolutely viable versus the AI. Armor 1 can be pierced by the AI, but it does not cost any extra steel. And finally, Armor 2, which was our go-to choice here, cannot be pierced by the AI. Higher armor tiers should only be considered for multiplayer, as they get very expensive. As Hammo mentioned, cruisers can also play another role as spotters for enemy navies. This is thanks to the fact that they can get very good detection and high speed. Now for this particular purpose I would use this design, and if possible you should try to add the best radar you have available, as that massively helps with detection. Other than that, you can make the design a little bit cheaper by removing some of these modules. They are not entirely needed. This design should never engage in battle, it's not made for fighting, but some anti-air can be good because enemy planes can still target it. The speed should always be enough to outrun the enemy fleet, so it should never have to actually fight.
By far the most common ship in your fleet will be the destroyer. They are the cheapest way to get screening efficiency, and they are excellent at being a submarine countermeasure. You can also make a cheap spotting cruiser, which is a bit more cost effective than using a light cruiser. The three main types of destroyer I would recommend using are the meat shield, the anti-sub warfare or ASW, and the spotting destroyer. Your meat shield is going to have literally the minimal amount of modules, just the cheapest engine and the cheapest gun on an early destroyer. An early destroyer hull screens just as effectively as a super expensive light cruiser, so pumping out heaps of these will protect your fleet from enemy torpedoes at a very cheap cost. You'll be throwing these into your main battle fleet, so they are effective on literally any mission. The ASW ship needs to be fast, have sonar, and carry depth charges. It's still relatively cheap, and when you make these, be sure to separate them out from the rest of your destroyers. You can use the different icons here to do so. They're most effective when used on the Strike Force mission, when paired with your spotting cruisers or spotting destroyers, or even land-based aircraft patrolling sea regions for enemy submarines. If you have the fuel, you can also protect your convoys by putting your ASW ships on the convoy escort mission through the sea regions where they're being attacked. Spotting destroyers follow the same methodology as the cruisers. Smack on some radar, sonar, and set them to never engage, and let them detect enemy battle groups on the patrol mission for your strike force to come in and finish the job.
In my opinion, when talking about the most effective designs, we could have stopped with light cruisers. However, it is true that destroyers are quite versatile, and as Hammo said, they can play several important roles in a proper fleet. The main reason to make destroyers is that they are incredibly cheap, so production cost is actually the most important stat here. We don't want to make them expensive, or we might as well just make cruisers instead. So for the cheapest absolute screens, I would go for this design. We are using the earliest hull to make it even cheaper, and only the basic modules. Now if you wanted, you could remove the torpedoes to make it even cheaper, although in this way at least it can deal some damage. When it comes to protecting trade routes and convoys, on the other hand, you will need to detect and destroy enemy submarines. And for that, you need at the very least some depth charges, and ideally, if you can afford it, a sonar and even a radar, as they massively help with the sub detection. Now personally, I would not go out of my way to get the radar just for these destroyers, as that's a bit of an overkill, but if you already have the facility, then it can be a worth upgrade. Overall, I personally never make destroyers, simply because the starting ones and the ones you steal from other countries are usually more than enough for the purpose. Yet, I know that Hammo particularly likes destroyers, and he has a favorite multi-purpose design, so I will let him explain this one.
Thanks, Mac. As a Navy enjoyer, I get quite excited about making designs just for the fun of it, which, while effective, may not be strictly optimal. So I'm going to show you my favorite kind of destroyer design, which doesn't really conform to the other classes that I talked about earlier. Firstly, the highest level of light guns I have, and as many as I can fit. I'll put them on there because this kind of light attack will shred enemy destroyers, allowing my cruisers to target their cruisers, leaving them with no screens very, very quickly. I like to add on the level 2 radar for the increased hit chance, but that is optional. I will always add on torpedoes to target the enemy capital ships once they're exposed, and I'll add in either sonar and depth charges if I'm not building a dedicated ASW ship, but if I am, I will swap out the sonar for a fire control module for more hit chance and change this over to another torpedo tube. I think that despite the high cost, if I'm playing as the USA or the UK or something, this is incredibly effective and it brings me a lot of joy. Submarines are the hunters under the waves and play an important strategic role in the game. While not super effective in naval combat, they are excellent at destroying enemy convoys, which not only reduces the resources and supply that a nation can get overseas, they can also sink troop transports, which will cause casualties and reduce a nation's war support. The later level submarines are incredibly hard to detect, especially if you add on snorkels or the rubber tiles through the special projects, and the AI will almost never be able to find and kill your 1940 submarines, which Machiavellian strategists will show you a design for shortly. A nation like the UK is extremely vulnerable to a persistent submarine raiding campaign. Surrounding their waters with boats on the convoy raiding mission will have them suffering for important strategic resources like rubber and aluminium. That is how you pronounce it. Fuck you, America. And you can make incredibly cheap submarines to not put a huge drain on your industry. If you are going to be convoy raiding, you should look for natural choke points, particularly regions like the Cape Verde Plan or the African coast and Iberian coast, which is going to cut off those major and common supply routes. Submarines are best used in groups of 10 to 20 and spread out in sea regions which are both natural choke points and away from coastlines as much as possible, particularly those in the deep ocean terrain, which will reduce your submarine visibility even further.
If your purpose is just to harass enemy convoys, well then this very basic and cheap design will be more than enough for you. This is not really something you need, as basically any submarine you start with or you steal will be fine for the job. If you are into cheesy strategies, however, there are a couple you can do with submarines. First of all, with this design, your visibility is so low that it will be virtually impossible for the AI to detect you. Now, once you optimize this with a good MIO and ideally a good admiral, stacking sub-visibility reduction, you will be able to sink entire navies without even being detected. It's a gimmick, but it can make submarines incredibly effective and fun to use, especially later in the game. You may have noticed that in this case we did go past the tier 2 modules and hull. This can actually be a great way even for minor nations to compete with major naval powers later in the game and with a relatively minor investment. Finally, since submarines are very cheap and cannot be detected right away, you can use them to bait enemy navies into engaging you. For that, you will select only one from your fleet, you will set it on Always Engage, and you will assign it on a patrol mission, leaving your naval bombers or the rest of your fleet behind. This works particularly well when the enemy navies are afraid of you and will not engage you otherwise. Once the enemy fleet engages your submarine, you can use the rest of your fleet or your naval bombers to engage and destroy them, hopefully before they destroy your sub. But well, that's why they are so cheap. Obviously, these tricks, both the invisible submarines and the bait tactic, will not work against other players, so these are only meant for single player.
Battleships, which for the purpose of this video includes battle cruisers and super heavy battleships, at the start of the game are being superseded by the aircraft carriers in terms of effectiveness, just like in real life. Theoretically, they should be great at naval battles, but when they can be sunk by a 30 IC naval bomber, the cost-benefit analysis starts to get a little bit stanky. Most major nations do start the game with battleships, however, and as a Navy enjoyer, I get the appeal of wanting to build them. Given that the extreme cost is usually better put towards carriers or more light cruisers though, if you want to play optimally, we would not usually recommend building them brand new for your fleet. What we would recommend as the best way to utilize the existing ones, however, is to refit them into AA battleships to protect your carriers. As I mentioned earlier, naval bombers target the largest ships first, and currently that works by the production cost or the building cost of the ships in a battle. So by refitting your battleships to be floating AA batteries with really high anti-air, they will essentially be rendering the enemy planes ineffective as they will target them first, and it will protect your carriers and the other ships in your fleet. As a super quick tutorial on how to refit your battleships, the first thing that you want to do is rename the design so you know what it is. Keep the original name though, because what you're going to be doing is only refitting the old Queen Elizabeth class ships in this case to the new AA ones. And then when you are upgrading your modules, you want to change everything except for the gun batteries, engine, and armor. The reason is these cost a extremely high amount of IC to change, whereas upgrading your anti-air batteries, changing over your secondary batteries to the dual purpose ones, if you're the UK or someone that has them, that is going to cost you relatively little. So you can go ahead and add on your upgraded radar and fire control to increase your AA further. And then once you have completed that, you will save the design and then go into your fleet, find your Queen Elizabeth class battleships, double click on one of them to select all ships of the same class, click on refit, select the Queen Elizabeth, and then click OK. So it's going to take 123 days per ship, which you can further reduce by going into the Spirit of the Navy and getting the naval refit yards. Now they're all going to appear in your naval production queue, so just make sure that you move any active naval lines to the bottom and finish them up to put your dockyards on there. Then you can just go through each of the different ship classes one by one, creating a new design and refitting them as you see fit. Being big ISC and manpower ships, battleships are really great for gaining naval supremacy in a particular region, and their heavy tack can also be used to support naval invasions with your fleet on the Naval Invasion Support mission, which will add a shore bombardment bonus to your Marines or amphibious troops. They do use a lot of fuel, so be mindful of that and put them on the Strike Force mission where possible, but refitting them into AA battleships is probably the best way to get bang for your buck using these massive vessels.
As Hammo already explained, the most important stat on both battleships and super heavy battleships is anti-air, to reduce the effectiveness of enemy planes and protect the rest of your fleet. On this battleship design we stacked as much anti-air as possible, so it is particularly good at that. It is very expensive, but you can refit your existing ones and the ones you steal into this design. For what concerns super heavy battleships, which by the way are unlocked through a special project in the Navy facility, we go for a similar concept. Once again, we want as much anti-air as possible, so we put a lot of anti-air modules up here. We also used a couple of these super heavy batteries, but you can use more anti-air if you prefer to. In my opinion, in single player, this would be quite useless. On the other hand, this can play a role in multiplayer, in which protecting from enemy bombers is much more important. Now, going back to battleships, or better battle cruisers in this case, there is another interesting feature worth mentioning, as these are the second best ship type in terms of manpower per production cost. Meaning, it's another great choice to get naval supremacy without fighting, much like the empty carrier we showed at the beginning of the video. Being much more commonly available than carriers, an empty design like this one can be great at getting naval supremacy without fighting. Just to clarify, the only difference between a battleship and a battlecruiser is the armor type you pick, so make sure to pick the cheaper one for this design. Before ending the video, we also wanted to briefly mention special projects which were introduced with Götterdämmerung. And let me say, some of these special projects are indeed cool. Like for other aspects of the game, the special project version of a design is usually slightly better than the original one. For example, ice carriers have a lot more deck size than regular carriers. The fleet submarine hull is better than the regular one. The coating, as you can see, is slightly better than the snorkel, and so on. The issue is that, in my opinion, outside of a role-playing scenario, heavily investing in the Navy is never really worth it. Actually, it's already hard enough to justify building a proper fleet when you can just steal the AI-made ones and use them for naval supremacy. In short, yes, some special project designs are better than the original ones, but in my opinion, not enough to justify building a facility, recruiting a scientist, and investing into them.
As much as it pains me to say it as a die-hard Navy enjoyer, I do have to agree with Machiavellian Strategist on this one. Most of the time, it is not really worth building a navy from a strictly optimal standpoint. You usually gain enough of a navy throughout the early game with your conquests that you don't really need to build one. It'll suit your purposes fine. And the special projects, while cool, aren't really optimal from a investment standpoint. There are much better things you could be putting your time and energy and resources into. What I will say though is don't let that hold you back. Honestly, once I learned and understood the mechanics of the Navy, it really became one of my favorite aspects of the game. And honestly, there are some times where you will not have the opportunity to gobble up other countries' navies, and you will have to know this and build up your own naval power from scratch to be able to do naval invasions. Either way, it's great fun to build it up yourself from nothing. You can come up with all the designs and see the fruits of your labor as you send the enemy ships to the bottom of the sea. Don't let your naval dreams be memes, essentially, is what I'm trying to say.
As a summary of everything we said, let's take 3 practical scenarios. First case, you're playing a major, so you can actually challenge other majors in naval warfare. In this case, most of the designs we showed here are absolutely viable. If you already have a big fleet, like the US or the UK for example, you can even afford to make some of the less cost-effective ones, like the super heavy battleship. If you have a limited fleet, on the other hand, like Germany or the Soviet Union, you may want to focus only on the most effective ones in order to challenge other majors. So in that case, I would only go for carriers or even just light cruisers. Second case, you're playing as a minor, but one that has access to early expansion and to nearby fleets. Mexico, which I played recently, is a perfect example of that. With early expansion, you can easily take all of the fleets from Central and South American countries, and with those fleets you can aim at getting naval supremacy, especially if you build some empty carriers or empty battle cruisers. Fighting and defeating major fleets might prove to be more challenging. Of course, in that case I would recommend going only for the most effective designs. And if it's getting quite late into the game, well then the submarine strategy could work quite well for that. Otherwise you can focus on light cruisers, and you can even invest a bit more in researches and unlock some more advanced modules. By the way, speaking of researches, let me mention very quickly something important here. Now, some of the researches will unlock new modules, but the disadvantage of this is that you will need to refit your ships to use these modules. Other researches grant passive buffs, like this one for example. These ones are very simple to get and very useful. Third and final case, you are playing a minor, but one that doesn't have access to any nearby fleets, and actually all of the Graveyard of Empires countries fit this role quite well. So in this case, it will be very hard, if not impossible, to challenge and defeat the eye. And in this case I would only focus on building empty carriers or empty battle cruisers, with the only aim to get naval supremacy and trigger your naval invasions. In the end, that's really all you need to win.
I hope that this helped give you a bit of a better idea about the Navy in Hearthstone 4. If you liked the video or if it helped you out, please consider liking and subscribing. And not only on my channel as well, but also check out Machiavellian Strategists as well. I'll link that below. He does some awesome stuff over there. So be sure to head over and give him some love. This was really fun to work with him on, and I'm excited to work with him again in the future. And if there are any other YouTubers that you'd like to see me collab with, let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next one.